Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Tonight we step into the marble corridors of a dying empire, where a teenage boy stands very still in a hallway listening to men decide whether his father lives or dies in a war 1,000 miles away. Picture the smell of incense drifting from a temple he does not believe in, the click of soldiers' sandals on stone, the way every door in this palace seems to be listening. If you had been born into this world, a world where an emperor could point at you and simply decide your fate before breakfast, you probably would not have survived long enough for anyone to write your name down. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, drop your location and your local time in the comments. I love picturing exactly where in the world you are as you drift off tonight. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. He is barely out of boyhood when he first understands that he is a prisoner, wearing the clothes of a guest. The eastern capital of Nicomedia glitters around him, all painted colonnades and imported marble. But young Constantine walks its halls the way a bird walks a cage it has decorated itself. His father Constantius rules far away in the cold provinces of the west, one of 4 men who now share the burden of an empire too vast for a single set of shoulders. And here is what you have to understand this arrangement: the tetrarchy was never about trust. Diocletian, the senior emperor, keeps the sons and heirs of his fellow rulers close, not as students but as insurance. If a Western emperor ever dreams of rebellion, his son's life in the East becomes the price of that dream. Constantine learns to read rooms before he learns to read scrolls. He watches the senior emperor, a tireless man who reorganized the machinery of Roman government through sheer stubborn will, and he takes notes without writing anything down. Diocletian is not cruel for cruelty's sake. He is a bureaucrat's soul wearing a warlord's title, a man who believes that order, ruthless and total, is the only thing standing between Rome and the chaos that swallowed it during the terrible century before his rise. And for a while that order almost works. Roads get rebuilt, currency stabilizes, the frontiers hold. But peace bought with total control always has a hidden invoice, and in the courtyards of Nicomedia that invoice is about to come due. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a palace right before something breaks, and Constantine feels it long before anyone says a word aloud. The empire's Christians, a stubborn and growing minority scattered through every province, refuse to burn incense to the old gods, refuse to swear the oaths that bind Roman identity to Roman religion. To most administrators, this looks like simple disobedience. But Galerius, the junior emperor stationed at Diocletian's side, sees something else entirely: a conspiracy, a poison, working through the veins of the army and the civil service alike. He needles Diocletian night after night, insisting that the empire's troubles trace back to this one refusal, this one crack in the old religious order. Diocletian resists at first. He has Christian servants in his own household, a Christian wife by some accounts, and he is a practical man who dislikes solving problems with fire. Then the palace at Nicomedia catches fire. Twice. Nobody can say with certainty whether the blazes were sabotage, accident, or bad luck in a city full of oil lamps and dry timber, and historians still argue about it. But Galerius does not wait for certainty. He points loudly at the Christians in the palace, and suddenly the whispered suspicion becomes an accusation nobody dares contradict. Constantine, watching from wherever a hostage prince is permitted to stand, sees the machinery of the state turn against people he has known his entire life. Servants, officials, soldiers who happen to worship differently than the men who command them. Here is the quirky detail almost nobody remembers. Before any edict is signed, before any church door is broken down, the very first act of what will become the Great Persecution is aimed not at ordinary believers, but at soldiers. Diocletian orders the army purged first, demanding that every officer sacrifice to the old gods or be discharged in disgrace. It is a strange, almost bureaucratic beginning to what will become one of the bloodiest chapters in Roman religious history. A purge that starts with paperwork before it ends in flame. Constantine says nothing. He has learned better than almost anyone his age the value of a still face in a dangerous room. But something in him is cataloguing all of it, the fires nobody can explain, the fear dressed up as certainty, the ease with which powerful men turn suspicion into policy. He does not know it yet, standing in that corridor, with the smell of smoke still faint in the air. But he is watching the opening scene of a story that will eventually place the fate of an empire and the fate of an entire faith into his own hands. For now, though, he is still just a boy in a gilded cage, waiting to see how far the fire will spread, and wondering quietly whether the men making these decisions have any idea what they are about to unleash. There is also a strange kind of dry comedy tucked inside all this imperial paranoia. Here is Diocletian, a man who has spent years perfecting an empire-wide bureaucracy of tax rolls and price controls down to the last coin, utterly convinced that his greatest threat is a religion whose founding story involves a carpenter's son who refused to fight back. Power, it turns out, has never been especially good at reading the room. Constantine watches the most organized man in the Roman world lose his composure over an enemy with no armies, no fleets, no treasuries, only conviction, and some quiet part of the young hostage begins to wonder what kind of strength that actually is. He tucks the thought away the way he tucks away everything else in this palace, because a boy who says the wrong thing out loud in Nicomedia does not get a second chance to think it over. The edict comes not as a single thunderclap, but as a slow tightening, the way a rope tightens around a wrist before the person wearing it even notices they can no longer move their fingers. It is posted in the Forum of Nicomedia on a cold morning, nailed to a public board where anyone literate enough can read it and anyone illiterate enough can have it read to them. And within hours a Christian man tears it down with his bare hands in full view of the crowd. He does not run afterward. He stands there daring the soldiers to do what the document says they are now permitted to do. They do. Constantine, somewhere in that palace complex, hears about the execution before the blood has even dried on the street, and something in the careful, watchful part of his mind files the moment away as proof that Diocletian's tidy empire has just torn a hole in itself that no amount of bureaucracy will patch. You have to picture the tetrarchy the way its architects pictured it, because on paper it is almost elegant. 4 rulers, 2 senior emperors called Augusti, and 2 junior emperors called Caesars, each governing a quarter of a realm, too enormous for any single man to hold together. Diocletian rules the east from Nicomedia. His old friend Maximian rules the west from Italy. Beneath them, Galerius and Constantius serve as the junior partners, each groomed to eventually rise into the senior seat when the men above them retire or die. It is meant to solve Rome's oldest and bloodiest problem, the chaos of succession, the endless parade of generals murdering their way onto a throne that never stays still for long. For a few years, remarkably, it works. Borders hold, armies march where they are told. And here is the detail almost nobody remembers about this system. 2 of these 4 rulers were by design expected to voluntarily retire after 20 years in power, an almost unheard of promise in a world where emperors traditionally left office only in a coffin. But elegant systems built by careful men still have to survive contact with ordinary human ambition. And ambition, it turns out, does not honor org charts. Galerius wants more than his current share, and he is patient enough to get it the slow way, by whispering, by manufacturing crises, by making himself indispensable to an aging Diocletian who increasingly relies on his junior partners' energy. The persecution of the Christians becomes his instrument as much as his conviction. Every arrest, every burned scripture, every confiscated church building strengthens his position as the empire's defender of tradition and weakens anyone who might hesitate to go along with him. And here is what you have to understand about watching this unfold from inside the palace. Constantine is not simply observing cruelty, he is watching cruelty function as a career strategy, and he is young enough that the lesson lands somewhere it will not easily wash out. The persecution itself spreads unevenly across the empire, which is its own kind of horror, a lottery of geography deciding who suffers and who does not. In the west, where Constantius governs, the enforcement is almost gentle by comparison. A few churches pulled down, some scriptures burned, but little of the systematic bloodshed unfolding in the east. Historians still argue about whether Constantius quietly protected Christians out of genuine sympathy or simple political calculation. Unwilling to destabilize provinces he needed loyal and productive. Constantine watches his own father's restraint, from a great distance filtered through letters and rumor, and wonders which version of the story is true. In the East, meanwhile, under Galerius and Diocletian's direct authority, the persecution reaches a ferocity that will echo for generations. Christians are stripped of legal rights, tortured for refusing to recant, executed in numbers large enough that later Christian writers will call this era simply the Age of Martyrs, without needing to specify which massacre they mean. Constantine watches soldiers he has trained beside men he has shared meals with, dragged before magistrates for the crime of praying the wrong way. Some recant under pressure and are spared. Others do not, and the empire makes examples of them in ways too brutal for a bedtime telling. Though you can imagine well enough what an empire capable of building roads across 3 continents is also capable of doing to a human body when it wants to send a message. And here is the darkly comic thread running underneath all this grinding tragedy, because the empire keeps meticulous records of everything and its bureaucrats. The same efficient men who built Diocletian's famous price controls and tax reforms now find themselves drafting paperwork for how many lashes constitute an appropriate first warning before execution becomes necessary. Order taken far enough starts to look exactly like the chaos it claimed to prevent. Diocletian himself grows tired. Years of holding an empire together by force of will have worn down even his considerable stamina, and rumors begin circulating that the senior emperor, true to that strange promise built into his own system, intends to actually retire. Constantine hears this news the way a prisoner hears a rumor about a new warden, uncertain whether it means relief or a fresh and unfamiliar danger. And if Galerius rises with no restraining hand above him, the persecution burning through the eastern provinces might no longer stay contained to soldiers and scriptures. It might eventually reach into the palace itself, into the quiet corners where a hostage prince has spent his whole adolescence learning exactly how dangerous it is to be noticed. Word reaches Constantine of something else too, something that changes the shape of every calculation he has been making. His father, far away in the cold and unglamorous provinces of the West, has fallen seriously ill. Constantius is dying, and every day Constantine remains a guest in this glittering, blood-stained Eastern court is a day he spends further from the one man whose death could either save him or leave him utterly exposed to whatever Galerius decides to do with an inconvenient hostage no longer useful as leverage. The Tetrarchy, that careful machine built to prevent chaos, has just handed Constantine the most dangerous decision of his young life, and the clock, quietly and mercilessly, has already started running. The request feels almost too simple when Constantine finally works up the nerve to make it. He asks Galerius for permission to travel west to see his failing father one last time, framing it as a son's ordinary duty rather than the desperate gamble it actually is. Galerius says yes. And here is what you have to understand about that yes: it is not kindness. Galerius has spent years watching Constantine the way a man watches a knife left too close to the edge of a table, and granting this request costs him nothing so long as he can control the timing. He agrees, then delays. He agrees again, then finds a reason to delay further. Days stretch into weeks of polite postponement, each one a small, deniable cruelty. And Constantine begins to understand that he is being kept exactly where Galerius wants him, smiling and patient on the outside, while the only man who might protect him from this court slips closer to death an entire continent away. So Constantine does something almost nobody in his position would dare. He does not wait for a third yes. The details of what happens next have been retold so many times by chroniclers with their own reasons to make Constantine look either clever or divinely favored, that separating fact from flourish is nearly impossible, and honestly, historians still argue about exactly how much of it is true, but the shape of the story survives across every version, and it is the kind of story that earns its retelling. Constantine leaves the Eastern Court at speed, riding hard through the night toward the great chain of way stations that crisscross the empire. The Cursus Publicus, a relay system of fresh horses and rest stops built specifically so that imperial messengers can move information faster than any single animal could carry it alone. At each station along his route, once his own horse is exchanged for a fresh one, Constantine reportedly does something ruthlessly practical. He disables the remaining horses, hamstringing them so they cannot be ridden, or simply driving them off so no pursuer sent after him can find a fresh mount waiting. Behind him, station after station, the imperial post system that Rome built to move faster than anyone else in the ancient world becomes, for one desperate stretch of road, entirely useless to everybody except the one man riding away from it. Picture it the way it must have felt from inside his own skin, because that is the only honest way to tell it. The cold air burning in his lungs, the unfamiliar horses beneath him, each one a stranger he has to earn trust from in minutes rather than months. The constant gnawing arithmetic running behind his eyes. How many hours of lead has he actually bought himself? How quickly will Galerius realize what has happened? How far can a man push both himself and a series of borrowed horses before anything breaks? He does not know, riding through unfamiliar provinces in the dark, whether he is fleeing towards safety or simply choosing which danger will kill him. A hostage who runs and gets caught does not get a second escape, but a son who stays and waits for his father to die without him may lose everything that matters far more slowly and far more completely. The route itself is almost absurd in its scale, cutting diagonally across the breadth of an empire that most people alive at the time will never travel more than a few days' journey from their own birthplace. Constantine crosses through the Balkans, through Italy, up into Gaul, covering distances that would take an ordinary traveller the better part of a season, compressed instead into a punishing sprint measured in days. And here is the quirky detail almost nobody remembers about this journey, the detail that makes it feel less like legend and more like an exhausted, aching human being, simply refusing to stop. Contemporary accounts describe him arriving so hollowed out by the pace that those who greet him along the way barely recognize the composed young man they last saw in Nicomedia's marble corridors. Whatever careful mask he wore in Galerius's court has been burned away somewhere on the road, replaced by something rawer, faster, and considerably more dangerous to anyone who underestimates him. He does not stop at the edge of the continent. Gaul gives way to the Channel, and Constantine crosses the water itself, chasing the last confirmed location of his father's campaign, into the damp, grey, unglamorous province of Britain, a corner of the empire most Easterners regard as barely civilized, a place of fog and cold rivers and restless tribes beyond the old walls. It is here, finally, on the edge of the known Roman world, that son catches up to father. Constantius, worn thin by illness and years of hard campaigning against the Picts in the province's unforgiving north, is still alive when Constantine arrives. Whatever relief passes between them in that reunion, no chronicler captured it in detail, and perhaps that is fitting, because the private moment between a dying father and the son who nearly killed several horses to reach him in time belongs to them alone, not to history's careful record. But relief in this story never gets to sit still for long. Constantius is dying, not recovering, and the campaign against the Picts is not finished. And somewhere back across the sea, Galerius has almost certainly discovered exactly what his hostage did, with a string of borrowed horses and an unguarded night. Constantine has bought himself time with his father. He has not bought himself safety. And as the two of them settle into whatever remains of a shared campaign in that cold northern province, neither one of them yet knows just how little time is actually left, or how completely the next few weeks are about to rewrite the Teutinos, a future of an empire neither of them fully controls yet. Constantius dies at Eboracum, the Roman name for what will one day be called York, in a modest headquarters building. Far from the marble and gold of Nicomedia, surrounded not by senators or priests, but by soldiers, officers, and one son, who very nearly did not make it back in time. The exact illness that kills him is lost to us now, swallowed by the vague language ancient writers use for any death that comes slowly from within rather than suddenly from a blade, but the timing is almost unbearably precise. He dies with Constantine at his side, close enough to see it, close enough that whatever words pass between them in those final hours become part of the story. Every future biographer will try and fail to reconstruct with certainty. And here is what you have to understand about a Roman army camp in the hour after an emperor dies: it does not stay quiet for long. Word moves through a legionary camp faster than any courier could carry it, deliberately soldier to soldier, tent to tent, until by morning every man under arms in that province knows that the throne of the Western Empire has just gone empty. In a properly functioning tetrarchy, this is supposed to be orderly. Constantius held the senior rank of Augustus in the West, and by the system Diocletian so carefully built, his own junior partner, a man named Severus, should rise smoothly into that seat while new Caesars get appointed beneath him through committee and consultation, calm and bureaucratic, exactly the kind of transition the whole tetrarchy was designed to guarantee. The soldiers standing in the cold British morning staring at the son of the man they just buried have other ideas entirely. You have to picture the mood in that camp because it explains everything that happens next. These are hardened frontier troops, men who have spent years fighting Picts in miserable weather for an emperor, most of them respected, and standing among them now is that emperor's son, a young man who rode across half the known world at breakneck speed, specifically to be at his father's side when it mattered. To soldiers who value loyalty and grit above bureaucratic seniority charts drawn up in some distant eastern capital, the succession looks almost embarrassingly obvious. And here is the detail almost nobody remembers about how this moment actually unfolds. Contemporary sources credit a particular push toward acclamation to Crocus, a king of the Alemanni, serving as an allied commander within the Roman ranks, a barbarian chieftain, technically an outsider to Rome's own political machinery, who reportedly rallies the assembled troops and helps tip the moment from grief into acclamation. There is something almost too perfect about that detail, a foreign king playing kingmaker for the future emperor who will one day reshape the entire religious identity of Rome itself. And historians still debate exactly how much credit Crocus deserves versus how much later writers embellished his role to make a better story. Whatever the precise mechanics, the outcome arrives fast and loud. The assembled soldiers raise Constantine on a shield, the old ritual gesture of acclamation hoisting him above their heads, while voices call out the title that changes everything, Augustus. Not Caesar, the junior rank. The Tetrarchy's own rules would have offered him as Constantius's natural heir, Augustus. The senior imperial title itself, the one belonging by rights to Severus, the one that turns Constantine from a promising young officer into depending entirely on how the rest of the empire chooses to react. Either a legitimate emperor or an open rebel against the very system he grew up inside. Constantine understands immediately just how dangerous this gift actually is. And here is what you have to feel in this moment, standing where he stood. The crowd around him is celebrating, shields banging together, voices raised in something that sounds like triumph. And underneath all of it, Constantine's mind is already racing through consequences nobody in that cheering camp is thinking about. Claim the full title of Augustus, and he directly challenges the man Diocletian's system actually assigned to that seat. Refuse the acclamation outright, and he risks his own soldiers humiliated at having their gesture rejected. Or worse, he risks looking weak to Galerius at the exact moment weakness could get him killed. There is no clean answer here, only degrees of risk, and Constantine, still hollowed out from a ride that nearly broke him, has to find the least dangerous path through a situation with no safe options remaining. What he actually does next reveals more about his political instincts than almost anything else in his early life. He does not simply seize the full imperial title and dare the world to stop him. Instead, Constantine sends word east, a carefully worded letter to Galerius himself, the man he escaped from only weeks earlier, requesting recognition not as Augustus but as the lesser rank of Caesar, the position that would have technically been his by succession in the first place. It is a shrewd, almost startlingly patient move for a man his age, offering Galerius a face-saving compromise instead of an open challenge. Buying legitimacy through diplomacy, rather than demanding it through the sword, his soldiers just handed him. Galerius receives this letter with visible fury, according to those who were near him at the time, trapped between an army's fait accompli and his own furious desire to reject Constantine outright. He hesitates, pacing, weighing options that all seem to lead somewhere he does not want to go. And in that hesitation, in that single furious pause inside a palace in Nicomedia, the fragile architecture of the entire tetrarchy begins quietly and irreversibly to come apart at the seams. Constantine has his army. He has a title, even a compromised one. What he does not yet have is peace, because somewhere else in this fracturing empire, other ambitious men are already watching the same opening and reaching for the exact same prize. Galerius, when he finally answers, does something no one in the room with him expects. He does not reject Constantine's request outright, and he does not grant it either, not exactly. Instead, he threads a narrow, grudging needle. He recognizes Constantine as Caesar, the junior title Constantine himself requested, but he elevates Severus, his own loyal ally, to the senior rank of Augustus in the West, the very seat many assumed would pass naturally to Constantius's son. It is a compromise built to satisfy nobody completely, which is in its own way exactly what a furious man forced into a corner tends to produce. Galerius gets to say he punished no one and rewarded no one, while quietly ensuring that the son of his old rival still answers, on paper at least, to a man loyal to him alone. And here is what you have to understand about this arrangement. It solves absolutely nothing. It simply relocates the danger, buries it under a new title, and waits. Constantine accepts the rank of Caesar because refusing it now would mean open war he is not yet prepared to fight, but acceptance does not mean submission. He governs his portion of the West, the provinces his father once held, with quiet, careful competence, building loyalty among his troops and administrators, the same patient way he built it on that desperate ride across the empire. He is playing a longer game than Galerius realizes, and he is very good at waiting. But Constantine is far from the only ambitious man watching this fractured settlement and calculating his own next move. In Rome itself, a city that the Tetrarchy's practical reorganization had quietly stripped of much of its old political importance, a young man named Maxentius watches the entire arrangement with something considerably sharper than patience. He is the son of Maximian, the retired senior emperor of the West, and he had expected reasonably enough some share of power when the Tetrarchy's pieces finally moved. Instead, he watched Severus, an outsider with no real connection to Rome's ancient prestige, get handed the very throne Maxentius considered his birthright. Rome, the city that once ruled an empire in its own name, had been reduced under the Tetrarchy to something closer to a ceremonial relic, its emperors ruling instead from Nicomedia, from Milan, from wherever the frontier happened to need them most. To a proud young man raised in the shadow of that old capital's fading glory, being passed over feels like more than a political slight. It feels like an insult to the city itself. So Maxentius does what ambitious, overlooked men in unstable systems tend to do. He acts. With the backing of the Praetorian Guard, that old and famously unpredictable institution once responsible for making and breaking emperors long before the Tetrarchy tried to tame Roman succession, Maxentius seizes power in Rome, declaring himself the city's ruler in defiance of everything Diocletian's careful system was designed to prevent. And here is the detail almost nobody remembers about what happens next, the twist that turns one usurper into a genuine crisis. Maxentius's own father, Maximian, the retired Augustus, who was supposed to be living out a quiet second act, somewhere in Italian villa comfort, comes out of retirement to support his son's rebellion. The old emperor puts the purple robe back on, not because the Tetrarchy calls him back to duty, but because his son has just torn a hole in the entire imperial order, and Maximian, whatever his flaws, is not about to watch that son face the consequences alone. Suddenly, the tidy architecture Diocletian spent years constructing does not merely have cracks. It has entirely separate factions claiming legitimate imperial authority at the exact same moment, each with its own soldiers, its own territory, its own claim to the purple. Galerius still holds the senior eastern throne, with a loyal Caesar named Maximinus Dia serving beneath him in the eastern provinces. Severus holds the western Augustus title Galerius, handed him, at least in theory, though his actual authority over Italy is now directly challenged by the father and son team occupying Rome itself. Constantine governs his own portion of the West as Caesar, technically subordinate to Severus but functionally independent in every way that matters. And in Rome, Maxentius and Maximian rule as a defiant, unrecognized pair, backed by guardsmen and by a city desperate to reclaim relevance. 6 men, by most contemporary counts, now wear or claim the purple robe of Roman imperial authority. At the very same time, an arrangement the Tetrarchy's entire design existed specifically to prevent, and here is the darkly funny irony sitting underneath all this. Diocletian built his 4-man system explicitly because the old Roman habit of multiple rival claimants tearing the empire apart through civil war had nearly destroyed Rome during the previous century's chaos. His solution, meant to end that cycle permanently, has just produced a chaos of 6, a number the old system never even had a category for. Severus, tasked with actually enforcing imperial order against the upstarts in Rome, marches south into Italy to crush Maxentius's rebellion before it can harden into something permanent. He commands on paper a formidable force, veteran legions that once served loyally under Maximian himself. Men who know these Italian roads and this Italian climate far better than any Eastern general could hope to. Severus assumes reasonably enough, given the numbers on his side, that this will be a short campaign, a swift punishment expedition against an overreaching usurper who mistook a moment of imperial distraction for a genuine opportunity. He does not yet understand that he is marching into a trap built not out of superior tactics but out of something far harder to plan against the sheer weight of old loyalty and older memory. He does not yet know that Rome's ancient walls and the desperate cunning of a father and son with nothing left to lose are about to turn his confident march into a catastrophe that will ripple outward across the entire fractured empire, reshaping the odds for every remaining claimant still. Watching from the provinces, Constantine included, Severus's march on Rome falls apart before a single decisive battle is even fought, and it falls apart in the most humiliating way. An emperor can lose a war not through defeat but through abandonment. His army, those veteran legions he counted on so confidently, had spent years serving under Maximian before Maximian's own supposed retirement, and old loyalty, it turns out, does not simply evaporate because a new man now holds the title. As Severus approaches Rome, officer after officer in his own ranks begins quietly slipping away, some defecting outright to the very father and son. He marched south to crush others, simply melting into the countryside rather than raise a sword against a commander they once swore themselves to. Severus reaches the outskirts of a city he can no longer take with an army that no longer exists beneath him. He flees north to Ravenna, a coastal city defended by marsh and lagoon rather than walls, hoping its natural geography can buy him time and shelter that his own vanishing legions no longer can. Maximian, the old emperor, who has clearly not lost his talent for this sort of thing despite years of supposed retirement, follows and lays siege. And here is what you have to understand about what happens next. Maximian does not storm Ravenna's defences because he does not need to. The marshland that protects Severus also traps him, cutting his supply lines and shrinking his options with every passing week, and Maximian, patient in a way his own son rarely manages to be, simply waits for hunger and dwindling loyalty to do the work that an assault might have cost him dearly. He negotiates instead, offering Severus safe passage and honourable treatment if he simply surrenders the title he can no longer defend. Severus, out of options and increasingly out of allies, accepts. The promise does not survive long past the surrender itself. Severus is taken into custody, held under a comfortable but firm imprisonment for a time, and eventually killed either by his own hand under pressure or by more direct means, depending on which ancient source you trust least badly. A sitting Roman Augustus, defeated not by superior tactics but by the simple gravitational pull of an old general's remembered loyalty, is dead, and Rome belongs for now entirely to Maxentius and the father who helped him take it. And Maxentius does not waste the victory. Whatever image later propaganda will paint of him, and you should know now that most of what survives about Maxentius comes from the pens of writers working for the men who eventually destroyed him. The actual record of his rule in these years shows a man moving with real political skill. He courts the city of Rome itself with genuine, calculated generosity, cancelling unpopular taxes that previous administrations imposed on the Roman populace. A gesture that costs him revenue but buys him something increasingly rare in this fractured empire: an entire capital city's loyalty freely given rather than coerced. He restores the old Senate's ceremonial dignity, treating Rome's ancient aristocratic families with a respect the Tetrarchy's frontier-focused emperors had mostly stopped bothering with. To the people actually living within Rome's walls, Maxentius looks less like a usurper and more like the first emperor in a generation who remembered that the old capital still mattered. Here is the mainstream fact worth sitting with for a moment because it reshapes how you should picture Maxentius. For the rest of this story, he pours enormous resources into rebuilding and fortifying Rome itself, repairing the ancient Aurelian walls that ring the city, strengthening gates, stockpiling supplies, transforming Rome from the ceremonial relic the Tetrarchy had left it, as back into what it once was for centuries, a genuinely formidable fortress capital that any invading army would have to respect and think twice before approaching. And here is the quirky detail almost nobody remembers alongside all that stonework. Maxentius also commissions a massive new basilica in the Roman Forum itself, a soaring, vaulted building of brick and concrete engineering so advanced that centuries of later architects, including a young sculptor and painter named Michelangelo, studying its ruins during the Renaissance, will draw direct inspiration from its structure. A man history mostly remembers as a villain in someone else's story leaves behind almost as an afterthought one of the most architecturally influential buildings in the ancient world. Historians still argue genuinely and productively about how much of Maxentius's reputation as a cruel tyrant reflects reality versus how much of it is simply the polished, self-serving propaganda of the men who eventually defeated him and needed a villain to justify the war. What is not in dispute is his strategy from this point forward. Maxentius has no intention of marching out to meet any future challenger on an open battlefield where numbers and momentum and the unpredictable chaos of combat could easily undo everything he has built. Instead, he intends to sit fortified, supplied, and popular behind walls that Severus's failed campaign already proved nearly impossible to crack through conventional siege. And somewhere out in the provinces, watching all of this unfold, with the same patient, calculating attention he has shown since his desperate ride across the empire to reach a dying father, Constantine begins to understand exactly what kind of problem Rome has become. Two emperors have already tried to solve Maxentius through half-measures negotiation hesitation, and both approaches ended in humiliation or death. Constantine watches the pattern with the eye of a man who has already learned more than once in his young life that hesitation is its own kind of danger, that the safest path forward is very rarely the one that waits for permission or for someone else to act first. Still officially only a Caesar, still technically subordinate to a system that keeps producing rivals faster than it can control them, Constantine starts weighing a very different kind of solution, the kind that does not ask permission first. The years between that quiet, watchful calculation and the moment Constantine actually acts stretch longer than you might expect, and they are not idle years. Constantine spends them the way he has spent every dangerous stretch of his life so far, building rather than gambling, securing his own ground before reaching for anyone else's. He marries Fausta, the daughter of old Maximian himself, binding his fortunes to the very family currently holding Rome, a marriage that is as much a military alliance as it is anything resembling romance. Maximian, ever restless, ever unable to stay retired for long, even grants Constantine the senior title of Augustus, outright a gift that briefly makes the tangled succession crisis look almost resolved. It does not stay resolved. Maximian, unable to share power with anyone for more than a season, eventually turns against his own son-in-law, attempting a clumsy plot to seize Constantine's throne while Constantine is away campaigning against the Franks along the Rhine. The plot collapses. Maximian, cornered and out of allies for the second time in this story, is given the choice to end his own life quietly rather than face public execution, and he takes it. And here is what you have to understand about that ending. Constantine did not simply eliminate a rival, he eliminated a father-in-law he had trusted enough to marry into. And the lesson that trust in this fractured empire is always conditional settles a little deeper into him. Meanwhile, the wider empire keeps rearranging itself around him, Galerius, the man who once tried to keep a hostage prince smiling in Nicomedia, sickens and dies, his final illness so gruesome by ancient accounts that even his enemies found something almost unsettling in the details. His death removes the one figure who might have held the fracturing tetrarchy together through sheer force of personality, and in his absence, the remaining claimants sought themselves into two increasingly hostile camps. In the east, Licinius rises to prominence, an old friend of Galerius now maneuvering for his own share of supreme power. In the west, Constantine's position strengthens with every rival who falls until only one obstacle stands between him and undisputed control of the entire western half of the empire. Maxentius, still fortified behind Rome's walls, still popular, with the city he rules still on paper holding the stronger. Tend. And here is what you have to feel in this moment, because it is the hinge. The entire rest of the story turns on the point where careful patience finally gives way to something bolder. Every advisor with any sense tells Constantine the same thing. Do not attack Rome, they say again and again, until the warning becomes its own kind of chorus. The city's walls have already humiliated one invading Augustus and broken his army before a single major battle was fought. Maxentius commands more soldiers, better supplied, fighting on home ground. They know intimately behind fortifications, specifically strengthened to survive exactly this kind of invasion. The safe, patient move, the move that worked for Constantine every previous time danger cornered him, is to wait to consolidate, to let Maxentius's own excesses or political missteps eventually do the work that an army might not. Constantine listens to all of it. Then he decides to invade anyway. It is by any conventional military logic of the era close to reckless. Constantine gathers a force considerably smaller than the one Maxentius can field in defense. Some ancient estimates suggest he crosses into Italy with barely a quarter of the manpower waiting for him behind Rome's restored walls. And here is the mainstream fact worth picturing clearly. Rather than take the obvious coastal roads into Italy, the routes any defender would naturally watch and fortify, Constantine chooses to cross the Alps directly, marching his army over mountain passes that a cautious general would consider suicidal this time of year, difficult terrain where a single bad stretch of weather or a poorly scouted trail could destroy an army faster than any enemy soldier. Picture the scale of that decision, the way his own officers must have pictured it, standing at the base of those peaks and looking up at slopes that seemed to swallow the sky. Thousands of men, horses, supply, wagons, all of it forced through narrow mountain passes where the column stretches for miles and where a small, well-positioned enemy force could theoretically massacre the whole army piece by piece as it emerges. Constantine gambles that speed and surprise outweigh the danger of the terrain itself, that no one on the other side expects an invasion to arrive this way through mountains rather than roads. In a season most commanders would call closed to serious campaigning. And here is the quirky detail almost nobody remembers about this crossing. Several of the towns and garrisons Constantine encounters on the Italian side of the Alps are so unprepared for an army appearing from this direction that they surrender or simply open their gates without meaningful resistance. Stunned soldiers watching an enemy materialize from a direction their own maps barely accounted for as a viable invasion route. The gamble so far is paying off in the way only a genuinely audacious gamble can, catching an entire defensive strategy flat-footed before it even has a chance to react. There is even tucked into the grim seriousness of an army crossing mountains in dangerous weather a small note of dry irony worth savoring for a moment. Maxentius spent years and enormous resources fortifying Rome itself against exactly this sort of invasion, and here comes his rival walking straight past. All of it through terrain, nobody bothered fortifying at all because nobody imagined in a car, army foolish or bold enough to try. But surprise buys momentum, not victory, and somewhere ahead, closer to the fortified heart of northern Italy, Maxentius's actual armies wait better prepared, better supplied, and considerably less inclined to simply open their gates to a general who just marched an army through the mountains in a season nobody thought possible. The first real test of Constantine's gamble comes at Turin, and it comes in a form nobody on his side particularly wants to face in open ground, a wall of heavily armoured cavalry bearing down at a full gallop. Maxentius's forces here include units of clibanarii, riders and horses, both encased in overlapping iron scale from head to hoof, a slow, terrifying wall of metal built to simply crush infantry through sheer mass and momentum rather than any particular finesse. Picture the sound alone: thousands of iron scales grinding against each other, hooves pounding earth, already trembling under the weight, dust rising like smoke off the churned ground. A noise designed as much to break a man's nerve before the blade ever reaches him as to actually kill. Constantine's officers, watching that wall assemble on the horizon, know that meeting it head-on with a standard shield line means being trampled flat within minutes. So Constantine does something that reveals once again exactly the kind of mind he has become through years of watching, waiting, and learning from other men's failures. He does not meet the charge head-on. Instead, he orders his own infantry to open their ranks as the armoured riders close in, letting the heavy cavalry punch straight through the gap rather than smashing against a wall built to stop them. And here is the mainstream fact, worth picturing clearly once the clibanarii are inside. Surrounded on all sides by soldiers, they can no longer simply trample Constantine's men close. The ranks back around them and go to work with iron-tipped clubs and maces, weapons chosen specifically because a blade struggles against overlapping armor scale. But a heavy, blunt strike to a joint, a knee, an elbow, a skull inside a helmet, does not care how much iron surrounds it. The armored riders who moments earlier looked unstoppable become trapped and immobilized, some of the easiest targets on the entire field. Maxentius's cavalry, the pride of his defensive strategy, breaks and dies inside a ring of Constantine's own soldiers, and the survivors flee back toward the gates of Turin itself. And here is the darkly funny cruelty of what happens next, the kind of detail that makes you wince even from this distance in time. The retreating cavalry, desperate and pursued, reach Turin's gates only to find them shut against them. The city, watching the battle from its walls, has already decided which side it wants to be standing on when the dust settles, and it is not the side currently losing. Turin's citizens refuse to open their gates to Maxentius's own retreating soldiers, choosing instead to let Constantine's victorious army approach and be welcomed inside as liberators rather than conquerors. A single afternoon of iron and blood has already started rearranging where loyalty in northern Italy actually lives. Word of Turin spreads fast, the way word of a genuinely shocking defeat always spreads faster than word of an ordinary one. And city after city along Constantine's path begins reconsidering its allegiance with fresh urgency. But the campaign is far from finished, and the next obstacle sitting across Constantine's route into Italy's heartland is not a field battle he can win through clever tactics alone. It is Verona, a fortified city nearly encircled by the fast, deep waters of the river Adige, a natural moat that leaves only a narrow approach for any attacking force, and defending that approach is Ruricius Pompeianus, Maxentius's most capable general, a commander with real battlefield experience and no intention of repeating Turin's mistakes. Constantine besieges the city, but here is what you have to understand about the danger sitting behind him, even as he does. Pompeianus slips out of Verona with a relief force gathering additional troops from elsewhere in the region, intending to catch Constantine's besieging army pinned between the city's defenders and his own returning reinforcements, a pincer that could turn Constantine's own siege into a trap closing on him instead. Constantine, informed of the plan, does not panic and does not retreat. He splits his own forces, leaving enough men to maintain pressure on Verona's walls, while personally leading a portion of his army out to meet Pompeianus directly, choosing to fight the more dangerous, more experienced general in open combat rather than risk being caught between two closing jaws. The battle that follows runs long into the night, an unusual and grueling stretch of combat by the standards of the era, torches and moonlight, the only illumination for men trying to tell friend from enemy in the chaos. And here is the quirky detail almost nobody remembers about this particular fight. Ancient accounts describe Constantine himself, not content to direct the battle from a safe distance, wading directly into the thick of the fighting, a risk that could have ended this entire story on a dark riverbank in northern Italy had a single unlucky blade found him instead of the man beside him. Pompeianus Maxentius's best general dies in the fighting, and with his death the relief force collapses into disorder and retreat. Verona itself, cut off from any hope of rescue, surrenders shortly after. Constantine now holds northern Italy almost entirely, a string of victories accumulating faster than even his most optimistic officers might have predicted when they crossed those mountain passes weeks earlier, cold and uncertain, wondering whether the whole campaign would end in disaster before it truly began. But every mile closer to Rome is also a mile closer to Maxentius himself. Still fortified, still popular, still commanding the larger force behind walls that have already broken one invading emperor completely. Constantine has proven he can win battles in open ground and desperate night fighting alike. What waits ahead at the true heart of this entire war is something considerably stranger than a battlefield. Something that will arrive not with iron or fire, but with a sign in the sky that Constantine himself will spend the rest of his life trying to explain. The road south from Verona narrows both literally and in every other sense that matters, until there is nothing left between Constantine's army and Rome itself. But the final stretch of Italian countryside and whatever Maxentius decides to do with the enormous, still largely intact force he commands behind those famous walls. Every mile that passes underfoot now feels heavier than the one before it, the landscape itself seeming to lean in and hold its breath alongside the men marching through it. And here is what you have to understand about the mood settling over Constantine's camp, as that last approach begins. Victory after victory has carried this army further than almost anyone expected. But every soldier marching with him also knows that Rome is not Turin and Rome is not Verona. Rome is the reason two previous emperors already failed, one through desertion and one through humiliating defeat. And the closer the army gets to those ancient walls, the more the earlier confidence starts curdling quietly and steadily into something closer to dread. It is in this atmosphere, thick with anticipation and unspoken fear, that the story arrives the moment this entire tale has been circling since its very first section. What exactly happened is something you should hear with open eyes, because even at the time, even among people who desperately wanted to believe every detail, the accounts do not fully agree with each other. And historians still argue seriously and at length about which version sits closer to the truth Constantine himself experienced. One version, recorded by a writer close to events not long after they happened, describes something quiet and private, a dream visiting Constantine the night before the coming battle, a vision arriving in sleep rather than daylight, instructing him to mark a particular symbol on his soldiers' shields before they march into what everyone expects to be the campaign's final, decisive confrontation. This version is intimate, almost ordinary in its framing, the kind of experience a tired, anxious commander might plausibly have on the eve of the most important fight of his life, his own mind processing weeks of accumulated tension into a single, vivid instruction. The other version, told decades later by a writer who claimed to have heard the story directly from Constantine's own mouth, describes something far larger and stranger, something witnessed not alone in a tent, but in broad daylight in brain, front of the entire assembled army. In this telling, Constantine and his soldiers together look up and see a shape of light hanging above the sun itself. A cross formed from radiance accompanied by words. The emperor later claimed he understood clearly, despite an entire army supposedly witnessing the same sky. A promise, a command that by this very sign he would conquer. And here is the detail that makes this version so much stranger and so much harder to simply dismiss or simply accept. This account insists the entire army saw it too. Not Constantine alone in some private moment of exhaustion or wishful thinking, but thousands of soldiers marching tired, weather-beaten men, all supposedly staring up at the same sky at the same instant and witnessing the same impossible shape of light. You have to sit with both versions honestly, the way any careful storyteller must, because neither one can simply be waved away. Maybe it was a private dream that Constantine, in the retelling over years and decades, gradually expanded and reshaped into something grander, the way memory so often does with the moments that end up defining an entire life, smoothing over uncertainty until the story finally matches the scale of everything that came after it. Maybe there really was some genuine atmospheric phenomenon, a sundog, a halo of ice crystals refracting light into shapes that superstitious, exhausted soldiers might easily read as a cross and a message from whatever god currently felt most present to them. Or maybe, and this is the version Constantine himself apparently believed and repeated for the rest of his life, without ever once wavering from it. Something he experienced as genuinely and unmistakably divine. What is not in dispute, whatever you personally choose to believe about the vision's true nature, is what Constantine does immediately afterward, without hesitation and without waiting to sleep on the decision. And here is the quirky detail almost nobody remembers about the timing of it all. He does not simply file the experience away as a curious omen to ponder later. He acts on it immediately, calling for craftsmen, requesting that a specific symbol, one he had reportedly never used before this moment, be prepared and displayed prominently across his army before the coming battle even begins. Whatever he saw, whether alone in a tent or standing beneath an entire army's collective gaze, Constantine treats it not as a story to tell later, but as an instruction to follow now immediately, with the full weight of his own reputation staked on a symbol his soldiers have never marched behind before. And here is where you have to feel the tension pulling tight, because this is not a small decision for a man about to lead thousands of soldiers into the most important battle of his life. Rome's own soldiers, and much of Constantine's own army, still worship the old gods, gods of victory and war who have carried Roman legions to conquest for centuries, whose favor generals have courted with sacrifice and ritual since long before anyone in that camp was born. To suddenly march behind an unfamiliar symbol tied to a persecuted minority faith on the eve of the single most consequential fight of the entire campaign is either an act of extraordinary faith or an extraordinary gamble. And standing in his own tent that night, watching craftsmen work by torchlight to prepare something new for tomorrow's dawn, even Constantine cannot yet know which one it will turn out to be. The symbol itself, once the craftsmen finish arguing over exactly how to render something none of them have ever been asked to paint before, turns out to be simpler than anyone expected. Two overlapping strokes forming a shape that manages to look both foreign and strangely elegant at the same time. It combines the first two letters of the Greek word for the man that persecuted. Marginalized faith has centered its entire belief around layered one over the other, so that a vertical stroke crosses through a looping curve. Simple enough that even the least skilled hand in camp can reproduce it in a hurry. And here is the mainstream fact worth understanding clearly. This is not some symbol Constantine invented on the spot in a moment of inspiration. It already existed quietly within Christian communities as a kind of shorthand identifier, something believers might scratch discreetly on a tomb or a ring, recognizable to each other without announcing itself loudly to everyone else. What Constantine does that night is take something private and nearly invisible and drag it without warning into the most public and consequential space imaginable, the front line of an entire army about to fight for the fate of an empire. You have to picture the actual work of it, because that is where this moment stops being legend and becomes something closer to lived, exhausted reality. Torches burning low against the cold night air, casting long, restless shadows across rows of men who should be resting before tomorrow's fight, but instead sit hunched over their own shields with brush or blade in hand. Craftsmen and ordinary soldiers alike pressed into service, because there simply are not enough trained artisans in camp to paint tens of thousands of shields by hand before dawn, working with whatever tools and pigments they can gather, some carefully brushing the symbol on with genuine skill, others scratching it hastily into the wood and leather with a knife point, a spear tip, anything sharp enough to leave a mark that will still be visible once the sun rises and the fighting begins. And here is the quirky detail almost nobody remembers about this frantic overnight effort. The results, by every honest account, are wildly inconsistent. Some shields bearing a crisp, careful rendering of the symbol, and others carrying something closer to a crude scrawl, a shape barely recognizable as anything at all beyond urgency itself, because there simply was not time before dawn to make every single shield match. Move through the camp yourself for a moment, drifting between the rows of tired men and flickering torchlight, and here is what you have to feel. Not every soldier, painting or scratching this unfamiliar mark onto his own shield, believes in the god it represents. Most of these men grew up honoring Jupiter, Mars, the old household gods their families have prayed to for generations. And many of them are doing this simply because their commander ordered it, the same way they would follow any order on the eve of a battle that decides whether they live to see another season. There is real unease rippling through parts of the camp, quiet mutters passing between men who wonder aloud whether abandoning the gods that have carried Roman legions to victory for centuries, even just symbolically, even just for one battle, might invite disaster rather than prevent it. Constantine does not force belief on anyone. He asks only for the symbol for simple compliance, and lets whatever conviction eventually follows arrive in its own time, if it arrives at all. And here is a small, dry irony worth sitting with amid all this tension, because history rarely resists the chance for one, and this camp tonight is full of them. Somewhere in that camp, painting an unfamiliar Christian symbol onto his shield by torchlight, is very likely a soldier who only a few years earlier might have been ordered to help enforce Diocletian's purges against exactly the faith he is now marking himself with an entire army's collective allegiance, pivoting within a single generation from persecuting a symbol to fighting under it. Whatever else this dawn represents, it is proof of just how quickly the ground beneath an empire's convictions can shift when the man holding the sword decides it should. Dawn arrives cold and grey over the Italian countryside, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly unreal, edges softened, colours drained to the pale grey blue of a world not yet fully decided whether it wants to wake. Constantine moves among his assembled soldiers one final time before the march resumes, saying whatever words a commander says to men, he is about to lead into the most important fight of both their lives. Scouts have already confirmed exactly what Constantine needs to know, that Maxentius, against every expectation built up over months of careful fortification and patient defense, has made a choice that will define the rest of this story. Rather than sit behind Rome's newly strengthened walls and force Constantine into exactly the kind of grinding, hopeless siege that has broken previous invaders, Maxentius has decided, for reasons that will be debated for centuries, afterward to march his own army out to meet Constantine in open ground. Nobody in Constantine's camp fully understands why, yet why a man with every defensive advantage imaginable would abandon it for open battle. But there is no time left to puzzle it out, not with the sun already climbing and the column already moving. The army forms up shields, catching the pale morning light, that strange new symbol visible across thousands of them, now crude on some, careful on others, but present, undeniably present, on the eve of whatever comes next. Somewhere ahead, close enough now that the weight feels almost unbearable, a river cuts across the landscape, and a bridge spans. That river, a bridge, Maxentius himself ordered built, and will soon come to regret trusting with everything he has left. Maxentius, in the days before this battle, does something that reveals just how much even a confident, capable ruler can talk himself into believing exactly what he wants to hear. He consults the Sibylline books, ancient prophetic writings Rome has turned to for centuries during moments of crisis, seeking some kind of divine confirmation before committing to a course of action. His own instincts and his own carefully built fortifications argue strongly against. And here is the detail almost nobody remembers, clearly the kind of detail that only reveals its full cruelty. In hindsight, the prophecy he receives states, according to several ancient accounts, that on this day an enemy of the Romans would perish. Maxentius, understandably enough, given everything he has built inside Rome's walls, hears that prophecy and assumes it describes Constantine, the invading general, the outsider, marching toward the city he himself has spent years defending and beautifying. Historians still debate how much of this oracle story reflects something that genuinely happened versus something later. Christian writers added or embellished to sharpen the story's irony, but whichever version sits closer to the truth, the outcome that follows makes the prophecy almost unbearably precise in exactly the opposite direction Maxentius expected. Whatever combination of prophecy, pride, and pressure moves him, Maxentius makes the single most consequential decision of the entire war. A decision every advisor who ever cautioned Constantine against attacking Rome would have recognized instantly as an unforced error handed to the enemy. Rather than remain safely behind Rome's newly reinforced walls, the very walls that already broke one invading army, through nothing more than patient defense, Maxentius marches his own forces north of the city to meet Constantine in open battle near the Milvian Bridge, an ancient stone crossing over the Tiber River just outside Rome itself. And here is what you have to understand about the specific fatal geography of the choice he makes next. Maxentius positions his army with the river directly at their backs, a decision that leaves his own soldiers no room to retreat, no ground to fall back into. If the battle turns against them, nothing behind their formation except water and a single, narrow crossing point that will soon become the most dangerous place on the entire battlefield. To supplement the old stone bridge, which alone cannot move an army this size quickly across the water, Maxentius's engineers have also constructed a second crossing nearby, a pontoon bridge, lashed together from boats and timber wide, enough to move troops and supplies but never designed to survive the sudden desperate weight of an entire routing army trying to cross it all at once. Picture it standing there in the morning light, this makeshift wooden addition beside the ancient permanence of Roman stonework. An engineering solution built for convenience, now positioned without anyone in Maxentius's camp fully realizing it yet to become one of the most catastrophic bottlenecks in the entire history of Roman warfare. The battle itself begins the way so many of these confrontations begin, with cavalry closing first, testing the enemy's formation before the main infantry lines commit fully to the slaughter. Constantine's horsemen, riding beneath that unfamiliar new symbol painted hastily onto shields only hours earlier, crash into Maxentius's own cavalry. And here is the mainstream fact worth understanding about how quickly this fight actually turns. Maxentius's cavalry, despite considerable numbers, breaks faster than anyone on either side expected, collapsing under pressure, retreating in a chaos that immediately begins spreading fear and confusion through the infantry lines standing directly behind them. Men who have not yet even engaged the enemy directly and are already watching their own horsemen flee past them in disorder. Once cavalry breaks and starts fleeing back through your own infantry formation, that formation rarely holds its discipline for long, and Maxentius's carefully arranged battle line, positioned with its back against a river it cannot cross quickly, begins to buckle almost immediately. You have to feel the particular horror of what happens next, because this is where the battle stops, being a contest of tactics, and becomes something closer to a natural disaster unfolding in slow motion, the kind of collapse no general on either side can fully control once it starts. As Constantine's forces press forward and Maxentius's own soldiers begin losing cohesion, panic spreads through the ranks faster than any officer can shout above it. And thousands of men, suddenly desperate to escape a collapsing battle line, turn toward the only route out available to them, that narrow stone bridge and the hastily built pontoon crossing beside it. Soldiers who moments earlier were fighting in organized ranks now become a single terrified crushing mass, pushing and shoving toward two crossings never designed to absorb this much weight, this much desperation all at once. The pontoon bridge, lashed together from boats and timber for convenience, rather than built to withstand exactly this kind of catastrophic overload, begins to fail under the sheer press of fleeing men. Timbers groan, ropes strain, and somewhere in that chaos the entire structure starts coming apart beneath the feet of soldiers who have nowhere else to go. Plunging men who survived Constantine's advancing sword lines directly into the cold, fast-moving water of the Tiber instead. And there, somewhere in that collapsing, drowning crush of his own routing army, caught between an enemy pressing from behind and a river that has just swallowed the crossing he was counting on, is Maxentius himself, the man who chose this, the ground who trusted this bridge, who heard a prophecy about a perishing enemy of Rome and never once considered, until it was already far too late, that the prophecy might have been describing him all along. The current pulls at armor never meant for swimming at soldiers already exhausted from fighting, and now fighting instead for breath, and the river that Maxentius positioned to protect his back becomes for swimming, in the space of a single collapsing bridge, the very thing that finishes what Constantine's cavalry started. By the time the water calms and the chaos along that riverbank finally settles into something closer to aftermath, word has already begun spreading through Rome faster than any official messenger could carry it, passed from farmer, merchant to frightened city gatekeeper, long before any formal announcement could catch up to the rumor already racing ahead of it. Survivors, stumbling back from the ruined battlefield, tell the same story to anyone who will listen, that the army meant to defend the city has broken entirely, that the bridge meant to secure their retreat instead became a trap, and that Maxentius himself, the man who ruled Rome for 6 years with real political skill and genuine popular support, is nowhere to be found among the living. Constantine's soldiers, searching the muddy banks and shallows of the Tiber in the hours after the battle, wading through debris and the wreckage of the collapsed pontoon bridge, eventually recover what they are looking for. Maxentius's body, weighed down by armor, never meant for swimming, is pulled from the same river he positioned at his own back only hours earlier. The prophecy he consulted before the battle, finally revealing its true and merciless meaning. And here is the detail that ancient sources record without much softening, the kind of thing this bedtime telling can acknowledge without lingering on the particulars. Soldiers cut the head from Maxentius's recovered body and raise it. On the tip of a spear, a grim and deliberately public proof, meant to travel and be seen far beyond the riverbank where it happened, that the man who fortified Rome so carefully, who courted its people with tax relief and restored senatorial dignity, is now unquestionably verifiably dead. There is no ambiguity left for any lingering loyalist inside the city to cling to. No rumor of survival or escape that could rally resistance around a leader who might still be alive somewhere in hiding. No shadow of a claim left for a desperate faction to rally behind in the weeks ahead. And here is the mainstream fact worth understanding about how far that grim proof travels. This is not simply displayed once and forgotten. Constantine's forces carry that same severed head first through the streets of Rome itself, past crowds who only days earlier might have cheered for the man it once belonged to, and later, remarkably, all the way to the province of Africa, a region that had remained loyal to Maxentius and might otherwise have kept resisting Constantine's authority indefinitely without absolute proof that their emperor was gone. A single grim object carried across the sea and paraded through streets and marketplaces far from the riverbank where it was first raised, ends a rebellion in a distant province more efficiently than any army could have managed through months of additional fighting. Back in Rome itself, though the mood could not be more different from grim finality, the city that Maxentius spent years fortifying, the walls he strengthened specifically to survive exactly this kind of invasion now, simply open gate after gate swinging wide without a single further sword drawn in the city's defense. Guards standing aside, as if the fortifications they manned so carefully for years had simply been waiting all along for this exact outcome. And here is what you have to feel in this moment, the strange emotional whiplash of it. The same Roman population that genuinely benefited from Maxentius's rule, that enjoyed his tax relief and his restoration of senatorial dignity, pivots almost immediately towards celebrating the man who just killed him, because that is how survival in this fractured, dangerous empire tends to work. Loyalty to a dead emperor protects no one. Loyalty to the living one freshly arrived at the head of a victorious army protects quite a lot. The Senate, that ancient and once genuinely powerful body now reduced under the Tetrarchy to something closer to ceremonial relevance, moves quickly to formally recognize Constantine, offering him the honors and titles that come with securing descent and Rome and the western half of the empire beneath a single, undisputed authority, eager, perhaps, to align themselves early with a ruler whose momentum shows no sign of slowing. Crowds line the streets as Constantine makes his formal entrance into the city, cheering a man most of them had never laid eyes on until this very day, celebrating an outsider who arrived by crossing mountains. Nobody expected an army to cross, who painted an unfamiliar symbol onto his soldiers' shields, who won a battle at a bridge the previous ruler trusted with his life and lost that life because of it. Constantine himself riding through streets thick with cheering crowds and grateful senators, garlands and flower petals, thrown before his advancing column by a city, desperate to welcome whoever holds power now carries something with him that none of these celebrating Romans can fully see, yet a private conviction shaped by whatever he actually experienced on that road before the battle, whether dream or daylight vision or something harder to name entirely. And here is where the tension of this triumphant moment quietly begins, building towards something that will unsettle the very people currently cheering his arrival. Roman tradition holds that a victorious general entering the city in triumph, after a war this consequential, proceeds directly to the ancient temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, offering sacrifice to the gods, who supposedly granted the victory, a ritual as old as Rome itself, one every triumphant commander before Constantine has performed, without hesitation or question, a fixed and unquestioned step in the choreography of any Roman triumph. Constantine's own procession moves through the city's streets past monuments and temples that have witnessed centuries of exactly this kind of ceremony, and the watching senators, priests, and ordinary citizens fully expect their new master to complete the ritual their entire civic religion depends on. What Constantine actually chooses to do instead is about to tell all of Rome something none of them are prepared to hear. Constantine's procession, moving through streets thick with cheering crowds, reaches the base of the Capitoline Hill and simply keeps going. He does not climb toward the ancient temple of Jupiter. He does not offer the traditional sacrifice that every victorious Roman commander before him, stretching back centuries into the earliest legends of the city itself, has performed as an unquestioned final step of triumph. And here is what you have to feel in that specific moment, standing among the watching senators and priests who fully expected this ritual to unfold exactly as it always has. A small, uncomfortable silence spreads through parts of the crowd, a silence made of confusion rather than outrage, at least at first, because nobody standing there has a category ready for what they are witnessing. Emperors change, dynasties fall and rise, but the rituals binding Roman identity to the favor of Roman gods have felt until this precise moment permanent, in a way that even civil war and 6 competing claimants to the purple never actually threatened. Priests of the old temples, men whose entire livelihood and social standing depend on emperors continuing to honor exactly this kind of public devotion, watch their new master's procession move past without pausing. And you can imagine the calculations racing behind their composed public faces. Is this an oversight? Some quiet advisor's poor planning, finally correctable with a private apology later? Is it deliberate insult? A new ruler, testing how much disrespect this ancient city will simply absorb without complaint? Or is it something else? Entirely something none of them have quite enough information yet to properly name. Senators, meanwhile, watch with their own particular anxiety because their entire institution has spent centuries entangled with these same religious rituals, their authority and social prestige inseparable from a civic religion that treats the health of Rome and the favor of Rome's gods as functionally identical. A ruler who publicly declines to honor that connection on the very day of his greatest triumph in front of the entire watching city is not making a small gesture. He is signaling, however quietly and however deniably, that the old bargain between Roman power and Roman religion might no longer hold the way it always has. And here is the mainstream fact worth sitting with carefully because it captures just how skillfully Constantine navigates this moment rather than simply blundering through it. He does not follow this snub with any immediate sweeping declaration against the old gods. He does not order temples closed or sacrifices banned. Instead, Constantine allows the ambiguity itself to do the work, letting senators, priests, and ordinary citizens draw their own private conclusions, while he continues governing with careful, deliberate vagueness about exactly where his own convictions actually lie. This is not indecision. This is a man who understands, perhaps better than anyone else currently alive in this fractured empire, that moving too fast against beliefs held by the vast majority of the population he now rules could unravel everything, his mountain crossing and his bridge victory just secured. That careful ambiguity finds its most enduring physical expression not long after, when the Senate commissions a magnificent triumphal arch to commemorate Constantine's victory, a monument that still stands remarkably close to the fierce, ancient Colosseum itself, for anyone who might one day walk past it centuries later. And here is the quirky detail almost nobody remembers about its inscription. The detail that reveals just how carefully this entire moment was being managed by everyone involved. The arch credits Constantine's victory to the prompting of the divinity, a deliberately vague Latin phrase that names no specific god at all. Pagan Romans reading that inscription could comfortably assume it referred to Jupiter or Sol Invictus, or whichever traditional deity they personally favored. Christians, meanwhile, understood perfectly well which divinity the emperor himself actually meant. It is in its own quiet way one of the most politically careful sentences ever carved into Roman stone, satisfying two entirely incompatible audiences with the exact same words. Constantine, also in these early months of consolidating his rule over Rome, keeps hold of a title that might surprise you given everything else happening around him. He retains the position of Pontifex Maximus, the traditional high priesthood of Rome's old state religion, a role every emperor before him has held as a matter of course, binding the imperial office directly to pagan ritual authority. He does not renounce it. He does not treat it as beneath him or incompatible with whatever private conviction now guides his own life. Historians still debate exactly how Constantine reconciled holding that ancient pagan title, while simultaneously favoring the very faith that title's religion once persecuted. Whether it reflects genuine ongoing uncertainty in his own beliefs, or simple unsentimental political pragmatism, or perhaps some combination, neither modern categories nor ancient ones quite capture cleanly a man straddling two worlds, because the empire he now rules has not yet decided which one it actually belongs to. What is unmistakable watching this entire delicate performance unfold across Constantine's first months as master of Rome is that something fundamental has shifted, even if nobody in the city can yet point to a single decree or law that proves it definitively. Only a series of small absences and careful silences that add up slowly to something no one can quite name out loud yet. The persecuted faith that once cost servants their lives in Nicomedia's palace corridors now has, for the first time in generations, a ruler at the very top of the Roman world who will not publicly sacrifice to the old gods whatever else he continues to tolerate and permit around him. And soon that quiet, deliberate ambiguity is about to become something considerably more concrete. When Constantine travels north to meet another powerful claimant to imperial authority, and the two of them put into writing exactly what this new religious reality is going to mean for every Christian still living under threat across the rest of the empire. Constantine travels north from Rome to Milan not for another battle but for a wedding, and here is what you have to understand about how thoroughly Roman politics of this era dresses its most consequential decisions in the language of family, wrapping the coldest calculations of statecraft in the warmer, more palatable language of celebration and kinship. Licinius, the powerful claimant who rose to prominence in the east after Galerius's death, arrives to marry Constantine's own half-sister, Constantia, sealing an alliance between the empire's two remaining major power centers through the same-time honored method Roman families have used for centuries to convert rivals into relatives. But the wedding itself, however politically significant on its own terms, is not the reason this particular gathering in Milan will echo across the next 17 centuries of history, remembered long after the marriage that briefly linked two rival houses has faded into a footnote. It is what the two men discuss and agree upon alongside the marriage that actually changes everything. Picture the scene the way it must have felt to anyone standing close enough to witness it. Two of the most powerful men alive, freshly bound together by marriage, sitting down together in a quiet room to hammer out policy that will determine the fate of millions of people neither of them will ever personally meet. Constantine arrives at this meeting already carrying the private conviction shaped by whatever happened on that road before the Milvian Bridge, already having publicly snubbed the old gods in Rome, already governing with a quiet tolerance toward Christianity that unsettled senators and priests alike. Licinius, meanwhile, though not himself a committed believer in the same faith, understands political reality clearly enough, recognizing that stability across a fractured empire requires settling once and for all the question that has torn apart provinces and cost countless lives since Diocletian first authorized the Great Persecution decades earlier. And here is what the two of them actually produce from this meeting, an agreement communicated afterward through letters sent to governors across both their territories, establishing religious toleration throughout the Roman world. Christians, for the first time in generations, receive explicit legal permission to worship openly, gathering without fear, in buildings that once had to hide their true purpose behind ordinary walls without fear of arrest, torture, or execution, for the simple act of practicing their faith. And here is the mainstream fact worth understanding clearly, because popular memory often gets this detail slightly wrong. What history now calls the Edict of Milan was likely never a single formal document signed in that city at all, but rather a policy agreement reached there and subsequently circulated as instructions to provincial administrators throughout. The empire historians still debating the precise mechanics of exactly how and when each individual province actually received and implemented it, and how much local variation existed beneath the surface of what looks at a distance like a single uniform decree. Beyond simply legalizing worship, the agreement goes considerably further, and here is the quirky detail almost nobody remembers about its actual scope, the detail that reshapes how you should picture this moment entirely. This is not narrowly written as protection for Christianity alone. The language explicitly extends religious toleration to every faith throughout the empire, a broader principle of freedom of conscience that happens to arrive at exactly the moment Christianity most desperately needs it, but which frames itself, at least on paper, as a universal right belonging to every subject of Rome, rather than special treatment carved out for one particular group. Property confiscated during the persecution years, churches seized, meeting places shuttered, burial grounds taken from Christian communities. All of it is ordered restored, with the state itself absorbing the cost of compensation, rather than leaving displaced communities to simply absorb the loss on their own, a detail that turns this from a gesture of tolerance into something closer to genuine restitution. You have to imagine what this actually means for the people who lived through the darkest years of this story. The servants Constantine watched, dragged from Diocletian's own palace, as a frightened boy standing in a marble corridor, soldiers purged for refusing to sacrifice the countless ordinary believers scattered across every province who spent years worshipping in secret, burying their dead quietly, teaching their children to recite prayers softly enough that neighbors would not overhear and report them. For those people, this agreement, arriving from a meeting in Milan, represents something almost impossible to fully process after so many years of fear. An entire legal and social order that once treated their faith as criminal now formally, officially, reversing course, undoing in a single set of letters what an entire generation of persecution had built brick by painful brick. But here is where you have to feel the tension pulling forward again, because peace on paper rarely arrives everywhere at the same speed or with the same sincerity, and this world has already taught you more than once how quickly a promise it can prove hollow the moment it meets someone unwilling to keep it. In the east, Maximinus Daia, another claimant still holding territory and still deeply hostile to Christian toleration, initially balks at fully implementing the new policy, continuing sporadic persecution in provinces under his control, even as Constantine and Licinius formalize toleration everywhere they can enforce it. And closer to home, within the very communities this edict was meant to finally heal and protect, a new and unexpected kind of conflict is already beginning to surface. Not soldiers against Christians this time, but Christians against each other. A bitter internal dispute, tearing through congregations in North Africa with an intensity that will soon land entirely unexpectedly on Constantine's own desk, forcing an emperor who has spent his whole life mastering political and military conflict to confront something considerably harder to resolve, with either an army or a decree, a fracture inside, the very faith he just spent so much political capital protecting. The letters arrive in Constantine's court from North Africa, not long after the ink on his new religious settlement has barely dried. And here is what you have to feel reading them alongside him. The particular exhaustion of a man who has just spent years and enormous political capital protecting a faith from outside enemies, only to discover that faith is now tearing at itself from within. The dispute, when Constantine finally untangles its origins, traces back to the darkest years of the persecution itself. The very years he watched unfold as a boy in Nicomedia's marble corridors. Some bishops and clergy, under threat of torture and death, handed over sacred scriptures to Roman authorities rather than face martyrdom, earning themselves a bitter label among Christian communities who considered such compliance an unforgivable betrayal of the faith. Men marked forever afterward as traditores those who handed over what should never have been, surrendered. And here is what you have to understand about how this old wound reopens into a genuine crisis. In Carthage, a new bishop named Caecilian is consecrated into his position, but a faction within the local church challenges the legitimacy of that consecration itself, claiming that one of the men who performed the ceremony had, during the persecution years, been exactly this kind of traditor, a compromiser whose own tainted hands, in their view, made everything he touched afterwards spiritually invalid. Rather than accept Caecilian, this faction elevates their own rival bishop instead, and within a remarkably short span of time, an entire region finds itself split between two competing church hierarchies, each claiming to be the true, legitimate Christian community, each denouncing the other as fraudulent and spiritually corrupted. Picture what this actually means on the ground in North African towns and cities, because it is far messier and more painful than a simple disagreement between distant bishops. Ordinary believers, families who worshipped together for generations, suddenly find themselves forced to choose sides in a dispute over events that happened years earlier, over the precise moral status of a stranger's actions during the worst period any of them can remember. Congregations split. Some families end up on opposite sides of a schism that will eventually take the name Donatism, after the rival bishop, who becomes its most prominent leader. And this division, born from genuine and understandable trauma about what compromise under persecution actually meant, hardens quickly into something considerably harder to heal, a wound that religious toleration alone cannot close. Unable to resolve the dispute among themselves, and now living under an empire that has just formally recognized their faith's legal standing, the losing faction does something that would have been unthinkable only a few years earlier. They appeal directly to the emperor himself, asking Constantine to intervene and settle the matter definitively. And here is the mainstream fact worth sitting with carefully, because it marks a genuinely unprecedented moment in the relationship between Roman imperial power and Christian religious authority. No emperor before Constantine has ever been asked to adjudicate an internal theological or disciplinary dispute within the Christian church, because no emperor before Constantine has ever held a position from which Christian communities would even consider bringing such a request in the first place. Constantine, a man who has spent his entire adult life mastering war and political maneuvering, now finds himself being asked to settle questions of church discipline and spiritual legitimacy, territory considerably less familiar to him than any battlefield. He does not simply issue a personal verdict from the throne. Instead, Constantine convenes councils of bishops, first in Rome and later in the city of Alps, gathering church leaders together to examine the dispute and render a judgment with genuine ecclesiastical authority behind it, rather than imposing his own untrained opinion directly onto a matter of church doctrine. Both councils, after hearing the arguments from each side, rule against the Donatist faction, affirming Caecilian's original consecration as valid and instructing the schismatic bishops to reconcile with the mainstream church they had broken away from. And here is the quirky detail almost nobody remembers about what happens next. The detail that reveals just how limited even an emperor's authority actually proves to be over matters of genuine religious conviction. The Donatists simply refuse to accept the ruling. They do not disband. They do not quietly rejoin the church that formally, officially declared them wrong. Instead, the schism hardens further, an entire parallel church structure, persisting stubbornly across North Africa, regardless of what councils in Rome or Arles decided about their legitimacy. Constantine, frustrated by an obstinacy no siege or cavalry charge ever prepared him to overcome, eventually authorizes more forceful measures, confiscating Donatist church properties and exiling some of their leaders, treating religious defiance the way he might treat any other threat to imperial order. It does not work. The persecution only deepens Donatist conviction rather than dissolving it, hardening a regional identity around resistance and suffering that will remarkably outlast Constantine's own lifetime by centuries still dividing North African Christianity generations after everyone involved in this particular quarrel has died. Constantine eventually relents, abandoning coercion in favor of grudging toleration, a rare and quietly telling admission that even the most powerful man in the Roman world has limits to what force alone can accomplish. But the larger lesson of this entire episode settles over Constantine with lasting weight, even as he turns his attention back to matters he understands considerably better than church discipline. Unity within this faith he has staked so much on protecting is proving far harder to guarantee than unity within an empire, and Constantine has precious little time to dwell on that lesson, because the fragile peace he built in Milan, sealed with a marriage and a shared promise of religious tolerance, is already beginning to show cracks of its own. Licinius, his new brother-in-law and partner in ruling the Roman world, has not forgotten that an empire built for two rulers has throughout its entire troubled history always eventually narrowed itself back down to one. The peace sealed in Milan, however genuine it felt in the moment of that wedding and that shared religious settlement, was never going to hold indefinitely, and here is what you have to understand about why. Because the reason has nothing to do with religion at all, and everything to do with an arithmetic problem. The Roman world has never once managed to solve peacefully, not under Diocletian's careful tetrarchy, and certainly not under two ambitious men bound together by nothing sturdier than a wedding and a shared signature. Two emperors dividing an empire between them works only as long as neither man feels strong enough to reach for the whole thing himself. Constantine, fresh off his stunning victory at the Milvian Bridge, and now the unquestioned master of the entire western half of the empire, grows stronger and more confident with each passing year. Licinius, watching that growth from his own eastern territories, cannot help but read it as a slow, patient countdown toward his own eventual elimination. Whether or not Constantine himself has actually decided on such a course yet, the first real fracture comes only a few years after the wedding that was supposed to bind them together permanently, triggered by a tangle of territorial disputes and mutual suspicion that neither side ever fully explains to later historians in a way that resolves all the contradictions in the 5 arse, each faction leaving behind an account carefully shaded to make itself look like the wronged party rather than the aggressor. Constantine, by some accounts, moves to appoint his own preferred candidate to a position of authority and territory. Licinius considers his own a provocation. Licinius answers not with negotiation, not with a letter or an envoy, but with troops. War breaks out between the two men, who only recently stood together at a wedding meant to guarantee exactly the opposite outcome. Fighting rages across the Balkans, a grinding, back-and-forth campaign that tests both commanders in ways neither the swift Italian invasion nor the earlier civil wars quite prepared them for, culminating in a bloody clash at Cybele, where Constantine, employing the same kind of decisive, aggressive tactics that carried him across the Alps years, earlier drives Licinius's forces from the field despite facing a larger army. Neither man in this first round manages to fully destroy the other, and here is the quirky detail almost nobody remembers about how this particular conflict actually resolves a detail that reveals just how transactional even the deadliest imperial rivalries could become rather than fighting to complete annihilation. The two exhausted rivals negotiate a peace that redraws the map of the empire considerably in Constantine's favor, expanding his territory deep into the Balkans while Licinius retains his core eastern holdings, and as part of the E10 settlement, both men agree to elevate their own young sons to the the rank of Caesar binding the fragile peace to the next generation in a gesture that looks on paper like reconciliation, but functions in practice as each side simply repositioning its pieces for whatever comes next. For a handful of years, an uneasy quiet settles over the empire, the kind of quiet you have already learned across this entire story, never to fully trust the kind that has preceded nearly every disaster this narrative has walked you through so far. Constantine governs the West with growing confidence, continuing to favor Christianity, openly building churches, granting the faith visible privileges and public honor that go well beyond the simple toleration promised in Milan. Licinius in his own territories watches this favoritism with mounting unease, and here is what you have to feel building underneath the surface. Calm of these years, religious tolerance so carefully negotiated between the two men at that wedding begins curdling in the east into something closer to renewed suspicion and hostility. The same old pattern of fear and control that once fueled Diocletian's purges quietly reasserting itself under a different ruler's hand. Licinius, whether out of genuine conviction or simple political calculation aimed at distinguishing his own rule sharply from Constantine's, begins purging Christians from positions of influence in his court and army, a slow, deniable rollback of the very promises made in Milan. And here is the mainstream fact worth understanding about how seriously Constantine takes this development. For a ruler who snubbed Rome's own ancient gods on the day of his greatest triumph, who has spent years building an identity increasingly wrapped around Christian favor and protection, Licinius's quiet turn against Christians in the East reads not merely as a political rivalry, but as a direct betrayal of everything the Milan Agreement was supposed to guarantee, a personal insult layered directly on top of a strategic one. Reports reach Constantine of Christian officials dismissed from their posts, of renewed restrictions creeping back into eastern provinces that had only recently tasted genuine religious freedom for the first time in a generation. Whatever remained of brotherly goodwill between the two brothers-in-law, already thin after one earlier war and one uneasy truce, evaporates entirely, leaving nothing behind but the cold calculations that started this rivalry in the first place. By the time open war resumes between them, both sides understand, without needing to say it aloud, that this conflict will not end the way the first one did, with a negotiated peace and a redrawn map allowing both rulers to survive and rule on, each nursing old grievances until the next convenient opportunity. An empire that has spent decades cycling through 4 emperors, then 6, then a slow and bloody narrowing back toward fewer and fewer surviving claimants, has room left now for exactly one man at its absolute summit, and both Constantine and Licinius, gathering their armies once more across the Balkans and beyond, understand with total clarity that only one of them is walking away from what comes next, still wearing the purple. The final war between Constantine and Licinius unfolds across both land and sea, a conflict considerably larger in scale than anything either man fought during their earlier falling out. And here is what you have to understand about the propaganda wrapped around it from the very start. Both sides this time frame the struggle explicitly in religious terms. Constantine as the Christian emperor defending a faith under renewed threat, Licinius increasingly positioned, whether fairly or not, as a defender of the old gods rallying against an encroaching new order. Ancient accounts describe Licinius consulting pagan priests and performing sacrifices before the decisive engagements, seeking exactly the kind of divine assurance Maxentius once sought and never received. And whether Licinius genuinely believed in that older religious framework, or simply reached for whatever symbolic weapon remained available to him, the framing sticks shaping how later writers, most of them sympathetic to Constantine, would tell this entire final chapter. The land campaign opens with a massive engagement near Adrianople, where Constantine's forces, despite facing an army considerably larger than his own press, their advantage with the same aggressive, decisive tactics that carried him across the Alps and broke Maxentius's armoured cavalry years earlier. Licinius, forced to retreat after heavy losses, falls back toward the straits, separating Europe from Asia, hoping the narrow waters of the Hellespont might buy him time and geographic advantage, the open battlefield failed to provide. And here is the quirky detail almost nobody remembers about what happens next. A detail that adds an unexpected and slightly bittersweet layer to this entire story. The naval battle that follows, fought in those narrow straits to determine whether Licinius's fleet can hold the crossing against Constantine's forces, is commanded not by Constantine himself but by his own eldest son, a talented young man named Crispus, barely out of his teenage years, and already displaying the kind of battlefield instincts that made his father famous. Crispus leads Constantine's outnumbered fleet against Licinius's larger naval force and wins a stunning, decisive victory, clearing the straits and opening the way for Constantine's army to cross directly into Licinius's remaining eastern territory. A father who once rode across an empire, hamstringing horses behind him to reach his own dying father, now watches his son achieve exactly the kind of dramatic history-altering victory that first launched his own reputation. And you should remember this moment. Remember the pride it surely carried, because this story will eventually return to Crispus in circumstances considerably darker than a naval triumph. With the straits cleared and his last significant defensive advantage now completely gone, Licinius's position collapses rapidly. Constantine's forces pursue the retreating emperor and his remaining army to Chrysopolis on the Asian side of the crossing, where a final decisive battle effectively ends any hope Licinius still harbored of continuing this war. His army, already demoralized by successive defeats and the sudden loss of naval control over the straits, breaks under Constantine's assault, and Licinius, with nothing left to fight for and nowhere left to retreat, finally surrenders. And here is where the story arrives at one of its more genuinely uncomfortable moments. The kind of ending that resists the tidy, triumphant framing you might reasonably expect after everything Constantine has built toward across this entire narrative. Constantine's own half-sister, Constantia, Licinius's wife, and the woman whose marriage once sealed the fragile Milan alliance between the two rival houses, personally intervenes on her husband's behalf, pleading with her brother to spare Licinius's life rather than execute him as a defeated rival. Constantine agrees, publicly promising mercy in front of witnesses, allowing Licinius to live out what everyone assumes will be a quiet, closely watched retirement far from any position of actual power. That promise does not hold. Roughly a year later, Constantine has Licinius executed anyway, citing accusations of renewed conspiracy and plotting that historians still debate the true substance of whether Licinius genuinely attempted some final desperate scheme to reclaim power, or whether Constantine simply found it more convenient, once his own authority had fully consolidated across both halves of the empire, to eliminate any remaining rival claim to legitimacy rather than risk it resurfacing later. Whatever the truth, the broken promise sits uneasily alongside everything else this story has shown you about the man at its center, a reminder that the same patient, calculating mind that navigated hostage courts and mountain crossings and delicate religious politics could also, when it judged the stakes high enough, simply discard a mercy it had publicly sworn before family and empire alike to honor. With Licinius dead and no remaining rival anywhere in the Roman world capable of challenging him, Constantine stands for the first time since Diocletian's tetrarchy, first fractured decades earlier, as sole and undisputed ruler of the entire Roman Empire, East and West, united once again beneath a single authority, an outcome that the careful architects of that four-man system would scarcely have believed possible when they first divided the empire, to prevent exactly this kind of concentrated power. It is an achievement almost nobody watching that frightened hostage boy in Nicomedia's marble corridors could have predicted, and yet here he is, master of everything, a professed Christian sitting atop an empire whose population remains, by any honest accounting, still overwhelmingly pagan in its everyday practice and belief. And here is the challenge now, waiting for him considerably harder in some ways than any battlefield he has already conquered, and one this faith he has protected and promoted and quietly favored for over a decade is not itself unified in what it actually believes about the very nature of the God at its center. And a doctrinal storm brewing among bishops scattered across his newly reunified empire is about to demand something from Constantine that no emperor before him has ever attempted summoning the entire Christian world to a single gathering and forcing it to finally decide together, once and for all, what it actually believes. The controversy tearing at Constantine's newly unified church begins, as so many of the deepest religious disputes tend to, with a single question that sounds almost simple until you actually try to answer it. A presbyter in Alexandria named Arius has been teaching that Christ the Son, however divine and however central to Christian worship, was nonetheless created by God the Father, meaning there was, in Arius's own careful phrasing, a time when the Son did not yet exist. To some ears, this sounds like a modest, even reasonable clarification of the relationship between Father and Son. To others, particularly the bishop who oversees Arius in Alexandria, it sounds like an assault on the very foundation of Christian belief, reducing Christ to something less than fully eternally divine, and the disagreement spreads outward from that single Egyptian city with startling speed-splitting congregations, provoking public arguments in marketplaces and church courtyards across the eastern provinces where Christianity has grown deepest roots. Constantine, receiving report after report of this spreading theological wildfire, reacts with the particular alarm of a man who has spent his entire adult life learning exactly how quickly fractures like this can widen into something far more dangerous. He has just spent years and enormous cost in blood and treasure reuniting an empire that spent decades tearing itself apart between rival claimants. The last thing this hard-won unity needs, in his own estimation, is a new fracture running straight through the very faith he has staked so much personal and political capital on protecting. And here is what you have to feel in this moment. Constantine does not fully understand, and by his own later admission never claims to fully understand the precise theological subtleties dividing Arius from his critics. What he understands with total clarity is that division itself is dangerous, and that something must be done to settle the matter before it spreads any further. So, Constantine does something no Roman emperor has ever attempted before. And here is the mainstream fact worth understanding about the sheer scale of what he undertakes. He summons bishops from every corner of his reunified empire, from Britain in the far northwest to Persia's border in the problem, distant east, to gather together at a single location and settle this dispute once and for all. The location chosen is Nicaea, a city convenient to his own residence and accessible by road and sea from across the Mediterranean world. And here is the quirky detail almost nobody remembers about how these bishops actually made the journey. Constantine funds their travel using the imperial postal system, the very cursus publicus, whose relay stations he himself once disabled, hamstringing horses behind him during that desperate ride to reach his dying father decades earlier. The same network built to move Roman messengers faster than any single animal could carry them now carries hundreds of bishops toward a gathering that will shape Christian doctrine for the rest of history. A small, strange echo linking the frightened young hostage of this story's beginning to the sole emperor now commanding history's first great church council. Picture the scene as these bishops actually arrive, because it is unlike anything Christianity has ever assembled before. More than 200 church leaders by most ancient counts converge on Nicaea, many of them bearing visible scars and injuries from the persecution years, men who survived torture, exile, and mutilation for practicing exactly the faith now being formally debated in a hall provided by the same imperial authority that once tried to eradicate it. Constantine himself opens the proceedings dressed in imperial purple and gold, presiding not as a trained theologian, but as the empire's guarantor of order and unity, a striking image that would have been unthinkable only 2 decades earlier. An emperor bowing his own considerable authority towards settling a dispute among the very people his predecessors once hunted. The debates that follow stretch across weeks, passionate and occasionally furious arguments between bishops defending Arius's position and those insisting his teaching represents a dangerous departure from authentic Christian belief. And here is a piece of colourful legend worth mentioning honestly as legend rather than confirmed fact. The kind of story that grew up around this gathering. In later centuries, tradition holds that one bishop present at Nicaea, a man named Nicholas, from the city of Myra, grew so outraged during Arius's arguments that he actually struck him, an alleged act of violence that later Christian storytelling would attach with considerable irony to the same Nicholas who eventually became the historical basis for the figure known today as Santa Claus. Historians treat this particular anecdote with real skepticism since it appears in sources written centuries after the council itself, but it survives precisely because it captures something true about the sheer intensity of feeling in that room. When the council finally concludes, the majority of bishops present affirm a position considerably closer to Arius's opponents than to Arius himself, declaring the Son to be of one substance with the Father, co-eternal and fully divine, rather than a created being who came into existence at some earlier point. This declaration, refined into what history will remember as the Nicene Creed, becomes the foundational statement of Orthodox Christian belief for centuries afterward, recited in churches across continents and centuries its original authors could never have imagined. Arius himself is condemned and exiled, his teachings formally rejected by the gathered authority of the church his own bishop once oversaw. Constantine, watching this resolution take shape, believes, at least for now, that he has successfully done for Christian doctrine exactly what he once did for a fractured empire, forced unity onto division through sheer patient authority. He does not yet know how wrong that confidence will eventually prove, nor does he know that his own ambitions for reshaping the world are about to turn in these same years toward an entirely different kind of monument, a new capital city rising in the east that will bear his own name for the rest of history. Even before the dust of Nicaea's debates has fully settled, Constantine's attention turns toward a project considerably more permanent than any council resolution. Something he intends to outlast doctrine, outlast politics, outlast even his own reign entirely. He has spent his entire adult life watching Rome itself function as an increasingly awkward capital for an empire whose real strategic and economic weight has shifted steadily eastward toward provinces richer in trade, population, proximity to the frontiers that actually matter most in this era. Rome remains in the popular imagination the eternal city. The ancient heart, the entire empire, supposedly still beats around a name, still carrying weight in every corner of the Mediterranean world. But Rome, in practical military and administrative terms, has become something closer to a beautiful sentimental burden distant from the eastern provinces, where wealth and threat both concentrate most heavily. So Constantine chooses a new location entirely, and here is what you have to understand about why this particular choice makes such obvious strategic sense once you actually look at a map. He selects the small ancient Greek city of Byzantium, positioned on a peninsula jutting into the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, a location commanding the crucial waterway connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, a natural choke point for trade and military movement alike. The site offers a defensible harbour, easy access to both continents, and a position considerably closer to the wealthy eastern provinces and the dangerous Persian frontier than distant Rome could ever provide. Constantine, the man who once crossed the Alps in a season everyone called impossible, sees, in this modest Greek city, the raw geographic potential for something considerably larger than its current humble footprint. And here is the legend worth telling, even while acknowledging honestly that legend is exactly what it is, because it captures something true about how Constantine's contemporaries understood his ambitions, even if the precise details were later embellished. According to tradition, Constantine personally marked out the boundaries of his new city's walls by walking the ground himself, spear in hand, tracing a line dramatically larger than anyone in his retinue expected for what was still at that moment only a modest provincial town. When advisors, startled by the sheer scale of ground he was claiming, asked how much further he intended to walk, Constantine reportedly answered that he would continue until the one leading him ahead chose to stop, a response his contemporaries understood as claiming direct divine guidance for the city's design. Whatever private conviction actually lay behind those words in the moment he spoke them, the construction that follows consumes enormous imperial resources and years of concentrated effort, transforming a provincial Greek city into something meant to rival and eventually surpass Rome itself in scale and splendor. And here is the mainstream fact worth understanding about how Constantine actually accomplishes this transformation so quickly, considerably faster than building genuinely new monuments from scratch would ever allow. He strips statues, columns, and monuments from cities across his empire, an enormous undertaking of imperial requisition, and transports this collected grandeur to his new capital, instantly furnishing it with an air of ancient prestige, borrowed wholesale from older, more established cities that had spent centuries accumulating exactly this kind of visual authority. Bronze statues that once stood in Greek sanctuaries, columns quarried and carved generations earlier for temples. Elsewhere, all of it converges on this single peninsula, creating almost overnight the illusion of a city as old and storied as the empire itself, though in truth barely a few years old in its new imperial incarnation. And here is what you have to feel about the particular character of this new capital, because it is considerably stranger and more layered than a simple story of Christian triumph over paganism might suggest. Constantine fills his new city with pagan statuary and classical monuments, even as he deliberately withholds the kind of grand pagan temple, complete with traditional blood sacrifice, that every other major Roman city would have considered essential to its civic identity. This is a city conceived from its very foundation with a Christian character built directly into its bones, churches given prominent placement and imperial favor from the start, even while classical art and imagery continue decorating its streets and public spaces, the old aesthetic vocabulary of Roman grandeur pressed into service for a genuinely new kind of Roman capital. The dedication ceremony, when the city is finally ready to be formally inaugurated, blends these same layered elements together in a single, carefully choreographed spectacle. Constantine renames the city after himself, Constantinople, the city of Constantine, an act of self-commemoration that would have seemed almost unthinkably bold from the frightened hostage boy watching Diocletian's court decades earlier, but which now, from the sole ruler of a reunified empire, seems merely the natural culmination of everything that boy eventually became. The new city receives its own senate, its own grain distribution system modeled directly on Rome's, its own set of civic rituals and public games designed explicitly to mirror the ancient capital. It is now positioned quietly but unmistakably to eventually eclipse. Constantine stands in these years at what should feel like the absolute peak of everything. His extraordinary life has built towards sole master of a reunified empire, founder of a glittering new capital bearing his own name, the man who steered an entire civilization's religious identity through its most consequential transformation in centuries, further and higher than that frightened boy in Nicomedia could ever have dared to imagine for himself. But even as this magnificent new city rises stone by stone along its strategic peninsula, something considerably darker and more painful has already begun. Stirring back within Constantine's own household, a private tragedy building, quietly beneath all this public triumph. One that will soon force this same emperor who has weathered civil war and doctrinal crisis, and every manner of political betrayal, to confront a kind of grief no amount of imperial power can protect him from. The tragedy that finally reaches Constantine's own household arrives without warning, the way tragedy inside a palace so often does, dressed at first in nothing more alarming than rumor and whispered accusation drifting through corridors far quieter than the ones this story began in. Crispus, the same talented young son who commanded Constantine's fleet to victory at the Hellespont, who once made his father proud in exactly the way a father hopes to be proud of a firstborn son, suddenly finds himself accused of a crime serious enough that Constantine orders his execution. The precise nature of the accusation remains even now genuinely uncertain, buried under layers of later Christian writers who preferred to simply omit this entire episode from their otherwise glowing accounts of Constantine's reign. And what fragments do survive suggest something involving Fausta, Constantine's own wife and Crispus's stepmother, though whether the accusation involved a genuine affair, a fabricated scandal, or some tangled combination of court intrigue and political rivalry that historians still cannot fully untangle, even after centuries of study, nobody alive today can say with real confidence. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Crispus, the son who rode beside Triumph and helped secure his father's final victory over Licinius, is put to death on his own father's order. a sentence carried out with the same finality Constantine once reserved for enemies on distant battlefields. And here is what you have to feel in this moment, because no amount of imperial power or religious conviction can ever fully soften what this actually means. A man who spent his entire early life racing across an empire to reach his own dying father, who understood better than almost anyone, alive exactly what a father and son bond could mean under pressure, now becomes the one who orders his own son's death for reasons that remain to this day, frustratingly and permanently obscured behind ancient silence and later cover-up. The tragedy does not end there. Not long after Crispus's execution, Fausta herself dies, and here again the ancient sources grow strangely quiet and contradictory. Some accounts suggesting an accident in an overheated bathhouse, others hinting at something considerably more deliberate, a death ordered, or at least permitted, by the same emperor who had just executed her stepson under accusations that, whatever their truth, implicated her directly and inescapably. Historians still argue without any real hope of final resolution, given how thoroughly later writers obscured these events about what actually happened inside Constantine's own family during these dark months. Whether guilt, genuine crime, political convenience, or some painful combination of all three drove an emperor who had shown remarkable patience and calculation throughout his entire public life to destroy two people closest to him within the same brief and shadowed stretch of time, a private grief, carried forward unspoken for the rest of his days. Constantine, whatever grief or guilt he privately carried afterward, does not speak of it publicly, and the empire's official memory of these events grows deliberately thin in the years that follow. Picture what remains of this once celebrated son afterward, because the empire's own effort to forget him tells its own quiet story. Monuments and inscriptions bearing Crispus's name are quietly altered or removed, an entire chapter of his own family's story effectively erased from the celebratory narrative surrounding his reign, as if enough silence might eventually convince even the emperor himself that it never happened at all. You have watched this same man across this entire story build an empire through patient calculation and occasional ruthless necessity, from disabled horses on a desperate road to a broken promise that cost Licinius his life. This perhaps is the darkest expression yet of exactly what that same capacity for hard, unsentimental decision-making could do when turned inward against his own family, rather than outward against rivals for a throne. Constantine continues ruling for another decade after this private catastrophe, governing his reunified empire and his glittering new capital with the same careful attention he applied throughout his earlier years, even as age and the accumulated weight of everything this long, remarkable life has demanded of him begins settling more heavily onto his shoulders with each passing season. And here is the quirky detail almost nobody remembers about how Constantine approached his own faith throughout these final decades of rule. A detail that reveals something genuinely strange about early Christian practice in this era. Despite decades of favoring and protecting Christianity, despite churches built and pagan sacrifice quietly discouraged across his territories, Constantine himself is never formally baptized during all these active years of governing. This was not unusual for the period. Many believers of this era deliberately delayed baptism until as close to death as possible, reasoning that the ritual washed away all prior sin entirely, and postponing it meant fewer opportunities to sin again afterward, while still carrying that final cleansing grace directly into the next life. As his own final illness finally arrives, Constantine, sensing death approaching in earnest at last, requests the baptism he delayed across an entire lifetime of ruling, warring, and reshaping the religious identity of an entire civilization. The decision that closes the circle on everything this story has followed since a frightened boy first watched fires burn in a distant eastern palace. And here is the mainstream fact worth understanding about the particular irony of who performs this final rite. The bishop who baptizes Constantine on his deathbed is Eusebius of Nicomedia, a churchman with genuine sympathies toward the very Arian position that the Council of Nicaea convened, and, championed by Constantine himself, had formally condemned only years earlier. The emperor who forced Christian unity onto paper at Nicaea receives his own final passage into the faith from a bishop standing on the theologically losing side of that very council, a small, quiet irony closing out a life that never stopped balancing contradiction against contradiction, conviction against pragmatism, patience against ruthlessness, right up until its very final moment. And so quietly the long story finally comes to rest. Constantine, dressed in white rather than imperial purple for the first time in decades, slips away not long after that final baptism in a villa near his own glittering capital, the fires and fears of Nicomedia, now nothing more than a distant, softened memory folded somewhere deep inside, a life that travelled so very far from where it began. The empire he leaves behind will fracture again among his own sons, will argue over exactly what his legacy actually means, but none of that unfinished business needs to trouble you tonight. That is a story for some other evening. For now, let the mountains he once crossed settle back into stillness, snow gathering soft and undisturbed across passes no army needs to climb again tonight. Let the river beneath that old bridge slow to a whisper, carrying nothing now but starlight and the gentle sound of water finding its own way home. The shields have been set down, the letters have all been written and long since answered. Somewhere far away, a new city glows faintly along its peninsula, its lamps dimming one by one as its own people finally drift off to sleep the way you are drifting now. The past, all of it, the fires and the fear, the courage and the quiet cruelties, has finished happening. It asks nothing more of you than to simply let it rest the way Constantine himself finally rested, the way every story eventually must. Feel your own breathing slow to match that stillness. Feel the weight of the day loosening its grip gently like a hand finally letting go. There is nowhere else you need to travel tonight, no roads left to ride, no walls left to cross. Just this quiet, just this dark, soft room around you. Let it hold you. Let your eyes close. Sleep now,